I have been a national park ranger for over 10 years now, and I never thought I would end up telling this story. I've always loved my job, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the peacefulness of the park. But everything changed when I was assigned to a remote and little-known national park tucked away in the mountains. Little did I know, this assignment would be the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at the park, welcomed by the dense forest and the sound of chirping birds. As I drove deeper into the park, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. But I shrugged it off as my imagination and continued on to the park headquarters. As I unpacked my things and settled into my new ranger station, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was a feeling that I couldn't quite explain, but it made my skin crawl. Deciding to brush it off, I reassured myself that I was just being paranoid and I was being one of the safest places on Earth. However, my feelings of unease only grew stronger as the days passed. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed whenever I patrolled the park or went out to check on the campgrounds. I even caught glimpses of a figure out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, as I was locking up the ranger station, I heard a faint whisper coming from the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like an urgent plea for help. My instincts took over and I followed the sound, my flashlight in hand. As I walked deeper into the dense forest, my unease turned into terror as I realized that I couldn't see or hear anything other than the sound of footsteps crunching leaves behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. But every time I looked back, there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder and more desperate as I continued on, until finally, I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden in the woods. Without thinking, I opened the door and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, the only light coming from my flashlight. It was filled with old furniture and dusty trinkets. But what caught my attention was the sound of a woman sobbing coming from the back room. I cautiously made my way to the room, my heart racing with fear and curiosity. As I pushed open the door, I was met with a horrific sight. A woman, with matted hair and torn clothing, was crouched in the corner, her eyes filled with terror. She was emaciated and had a look of madness in her eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to speak to her, but she was continuing to sob uncontrollably. It wasn't until she reached out and grabbed my arm with a strength that didn't match her frail appearance that I realized I needed to get help. I made a run for it, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. Shaken and unable to explain what had just happened, I called the authorities and led them to the cabin. But when we arrived, the cabin was nowhere to be found. It was as if it just disappeared into the thin air. The woman was also gone, leaving only behind a few shreds of her clothing. To this day, no one knows what happened to her or she could have survived in these conditions. As if the stranger encounter wasn't enough, things only got worse as the days passed. Campers reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the forest, and some even claimed that had been chased by something they couldn't see. The park animals, usually docile, had become aggressive, and I could no longer deny that something was not right in this park. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending long hours researching the history of the park and the surrounding area. That's when I stumbled upon a newspaper article from the early 1900s. It detailed the disappearance of a young couple who had been camping in the park. The bodies were never found, and it was rumored that they were killed by a mysterious creature that roamed the woods. As I delved deeper into the history of the park, I found more stories of people disappearing without a trace. Some were hikers, others were campers, but all had one thing in common. They seemed to vanish without a trace. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten journal I found in the Arctic in the ranger station. It belonged to a former ranger who had also been stationed at this park. The journal detailed his descent into madness as he claimed to have been tormented by a malevolent force in the woods. He wrote a strange occurrence, in unexplainable noises, and the feeling of being constantly followed. As I read through the journal, I couldn't shake off the feeling that the ranger who wrote it was still present in the park, watching over me. That's when I realized that the woman I had encountered in the cabin may have been one of the missing campers, a victim of the same force that had been tormenting the park for decades. With my newfound knowledge, I could no longer ignore the fact that something dark and evil had taken residence in this park. I knew I had to leave, but every time I tried to pack up my things, I would hear the whispers and footsteps, almost as if the forest was trying to trap me here. I eventually made it out of the park, but the experience has left me scared and changed forever.